Hello, my name is Garvin, and I read things and rattle on about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today, we're continuing our look at the evolution of the idea of Lemuria. How did this go from a scientific theory about a land bridge to a mythical lost land that's the cradle of human evolution and possibly human civilization? Well, for our next step, we have to look at the German contribution to this idea, and to do that, we got to talk about an artist and a scientist named Dr. Enst Hackel. Dr. Hackel grew up in a world that was very different from the one we live in. Just to give you guys a concrete example, he was actually born before the unification of Germany. Born 16th February in 1834 in Potsdam, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. So when he grew up, Germany was a region, not a country. And that's just one of the big changes he would live through. Now, as a young man, he was always drawn to zoology, especially marine biology. But at the insistence of his family, he studied for a medical degree because he wanted to be a good son. So he attended the University of Berlin and graduated in 1857 and ran into a problem because he quickly learned he didn't like dealing with human patients. And I'm actually going to defend Dr. Hackel here because I have worked in customer service positions. Some of y'all are hard to deal with. I just want to throw that out there. Some people out there are really hard and difficult to deal with when they're healthy and supposedly happy, never mind when they're sick or injured or in pain. So I understand where Dr. Hackel is coming from here. Well, he stuck it out until 1859. And then he underwent two experiences that would change his life forever. First, he traveled to Italy and learned to paint. And it turns out he was really, really good at painting. The second experience, and the one that's a bit more relevant to us, is he read Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin, introducing him to the idea of evolution. When he read that book, something just clicked for him, because he didn't just believe in evolution, he would become one of its most fiery and passionate advocates in Europe. Although, interestingly enough, he didn't agree with Darwin's idea of natural selection. He took a more, what we would call, Lamarckian stance, believing that species took on characteristics from their environment or interactions with their environment that led to biological change, as opposed to natural selection. Now, another big thing that happened while he was in Italy is he went to the city of Messina, and he observed single-celled organisms called radiolarans through a microscope. And then he began to draw and paint them. And his art was honestly fantastic. You should be seeing an example of his art on the screen right now. Tell me this isn't good. His art would help him become a major figure in zoology, as he named and drew thousands of single-celled and invertebrate species. He would also return to school and become a professor of zoology at the University of Jena in 1861. Dr. Hackel's contributions to science weren't just limited to his art, however. He would also be the first to coin many of the words we still use in biology today. He was the guy who first used the word ecology and phylum, for example, and another word he coined was phylogenetic, which is the study of evolutionary relationships between organisms. In 1864, he would send Charles Darwin 2 volumes of his artistic work, who promptly wrote back that this was some of the most magnificent artwork he had ever seen, and he was really proud to have them and thankful. Dr. Hackel would continue to be a loud and proud champion of evolution in Germany, and would further that in 1868 by publishing his book, The History of Creation, or The Development of the Earth and Its Inhabitants by the Action of Natural Causes. Whew. And I thought I saw a lot of light novels that had super long titles. This one, though, this is up there. His most famous work, however, is the multi-volume series simply titled Art Forms in Nature. He released that in 1904, and those books contain hundreds of illustrations and were and are considered a rather glorious visual encyclopedia of living creatures. To just briefly touch on his personal life, he would be married twice. His first wife, Anne, sadly dying in 1864, and in her memory, he named a jellyfish that he thought was especially beautiful after her. He would remarry in 1867 to Agnes, and he and Agnes would have 3 children. It is interesting to note that his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was born in 1871, which is the same year Germany would be unified. Dr. Hackel himself would die in 1919, 4 years after Agnes passed away. And that said, for all of his passionate devotion to science, he also promoted and championed some rather wrong-headed, and in some cases some really dark ideas, and it's time we dived into that. First, he was a big supporter of the theory of recapitulation, which, to give a simplified version of it, is the idea that an organism's development as an embryo repeats or recapitulates the species' evolutionary development. To support this, he would draw charts of embryonic development that were greatly oversimplified and, at least in some cases, inaccurate. And some have made the accusations that he fudged the art on purpose to create more support for his beliefs. I do want to note that while I've run over those accusations, I haven't found any real concrete proof that he was purposefully presenting bad evidence to support these theories. More damning, however, he was a promoter of scientific racism, believing that different human ethnic groups, or races as they're called, had evolved from different ancestors, and as such, some humans were, quote, more evolved, unquote, than others. To be blunt, he thought white people were the most evolved group, and he divided everyone else into different races. He had about 10 races total, and of course, he put black people on the bottom of the list. Which is bullshit, and I'm not going to pretend it's anything but. I do have to mention that some Nazi thinkers were influenced by his ideas, and it didn't help that he also preached that politics was just applied biology, which is a very dangerous idea, and one that I think has created a lot of harm. Although, to be fair to Dr. Hackel, I should also note that the Nazis banned a lot of his books, because, among other things, he also repeatedly called for the inclusions of Jews into German society, and argued that Jews were big contributors to German culture. But I can hear you asking out there, okay, what does any of this have to do with Lemuria? Enst Hackel opposed the out-of-Africa theory, which is a theory that suggests that humanity evolved in Africa first and spread out of there. It is a widely accepted theory in evolution today. Hackel instead promoted the out-of-Asia theory, or more specifically, I should probably call it the out-of-India theory, because he believed the Indian subcontinent was where humanity first evolved. But he had a really big problem trying to promote this, because there were no early hominid fossils in India. And even back then, they were finding early human ancestors in Africa. But then here comes the theory of Lemuria has this land bridge that connects India to Africa, and Dr. Hackel seizes on it because it's the solution to his problem. The reason he would proclaim that we hadn't found any early hominid fossils in India was simple. They were all under the Indian Ocean because they were taken there when Lemuria sank to the bottom of the sea. And that also conveniently explained why all those fossils in Africa were there, because those were people who migrated out of Lemuria into Africa. So this kind of helps him explain away all the weaknesses in his lack of physical evidence with a nice little ribbon, doesn't it? Dr. Hackel would start writing and speaking about his ideas of Lemuria as the cradle of humanity basically throughout the 1860s and 70s. He would cap this off by publishing a book in 1884 called History of Creation, where he would draw maps showing his believed migration routes out of Lemuria. In fact, a copy of that map should be on the screen right now. And to be honest, it's a very well done map, and it does excite the imagination. Just looking at it, I can kind of see this all in my head, and it becomes very tempting to believe in, even though I know better. And as if this wasn't enough, he would also start referring to Lemuria as paradise, linking it to the story of the Garden of Eden. This is important because by this time, he's a rather well-known man, and was often called the Charles Darwin of Germany. And this gives the idea of Lemuria this sort of legitimacy, and propels it from being an honestly somewhat obscure theory explaining how lemurs got to Madagascar from India, to this now widely known idea that was linked to human evolution, the origin of our species, and to the origin of civilization itself. And that got people really excited, and they started thinking. So to boil this down, Dr. Hackel is the guy who brought Lemuria into pop culture, into the popular consciousness. He's the one who dragged it out where everyone could see it and say, hey guys, this is where we all really come from. And next week, we're going to look at what happened next, because once it got out of the scientific community, there was a group of people who grabbed this idea and they ran with it. But I think here is a good stopping point for this week. So let me just say I hope you found this video informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like a voice on future subjects, consider joining the Patreon for $1 a month. There's a link in the description below. You can also leave a donation on my Ko-fi site if you just want to leave a one-time tip. If you do, please feel free to leave a request for a future video as well, and I will put it on the list of things for my patrons to vote for. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to give a special thanks to my biggest supporter, Big Steve. I hope you enjoyed this one, man, and I hope you enjoy the next one. Speaking of, join me next week for when we really get wild with Lemuria. But until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.